I was standing on my own porch, keys in my hand, when my daughter-in-law pointed at me like I was a stranger off the street and screamed at the top of her lungs, "He's trespassing. Someone call the police, he's trespassing." 3 neighbors came out onto their lawns. A man walking his dog stopped dead in the middle of the road. And I just stood there, 68 years old, holding the same brass key I'd carried in my pocket for 11 years, watching my son's wife perform hysteria for an audience while she blocked the doorway of the house I built with my own 2 hands. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I stepped back, smiled at Mrs. Ruiz across the street so she wouldn't worry, and got in my car. But I want you to understand something before I go any further. I had already installed cameras in that house 11 days earlier. And 40 minutes after that little performance on my porch, I sat in a motel room outside Cedar Falls and watched, in high definition, exactly why she needed the whole street to believe I didn't belong in my own home. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If a story like this means something to you, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city or your country in the comments before we go any further. And one quick note before we begin. Some names, timelines, and details in this account have been adjusted for privacy and for the sake of telling it clearly, but the pattern underneath it, the kind of quiet, patient cruelty that hides behind a smiling face at your own dinner table, that part is real, and it happens more often than most people want to admit. If that's not the kind of story you're in the mood for tonight, this is a good moment to step away. But if you're still with me, settle in, because this one took me 4 months to untangle, and I'm going to walk you through every single day of it. My name is Edwin Marsh. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, the kind of man who got called out to construction sites at 2 in the morning because a foundation looked wrong to somebody and they needed a second set of eyes before they poured another truckload of concrete on top of a mistake. I know how to look at something that seems solid and find the hairline crack underneath it. I didn't know, until 4 months ago, that the skill would end up saving my own life. I live at 1417 Winslow Court, in a town called Cedar Falls, in a house I designed myself in 1988 and built with a contractor named Pete Duval, who's been dead 11 years now and who used to tell me I was the only engineer he ever met who actually knew which end of a hammer to hold. My wife, Margaret, picked out the kitchen tile and the paint colors and the maple tree we planted in the front yard the same week our son Bradley was born. Margaret passed 3 years ago this coming spring. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 5 months. I still make coffee for 2 most mornings out of habit and pour the second cup down the sink before I've had a chance to think about it. Bradley is 38 now. Good kid, always was. Quiet, a little anxious as a boy, the kind of child who checked twice to make sure the stove was off. He works in commercial insurance now, does well enough, and 4 years ago he married a woman named Vanessa Cole, and I want to be fair to myself here and tell you that I liked her at first. She was warm in a way that felt easy, the kind of warmth that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room. She asked good questions. She remembered things, birthdays, the name of my dentist, the fact that I take my coffee black. Margaret would have said she was attentive, and Margaret, God rest her, was rarely wrong about people. But Margaret never met her. Vanessa came into our family 8 months after the funeral, when I was still walking around my own house like a man who'd lost a limb and hadn't noticed the blood yet. For the first 2 years, I had no complaints. Vanessa called me every Sunday. She and Bradley came to dinner every other week, and she always brought something, a pie, a bottle of wine, once a whole ham for no occasion at all, just because, she said, she'd seen it on sale and thought of me. I told my late brother-in-law, Frank, over the phone once, that I'd gotten lucky with that one, that Bradley had picked well. Frank laughed and said, "Give it time, Edwin. Everybody's easy to love before they need something from you." I should have written that down somewhere, I'd remember it. The shift, when I look back now with everything I know, started small enough that I genuinely believed I was imagining it. About a year and a half ago, Vanessa began asking questions that seemed, on their surface, like ordinary concern. Dad, have you thought about what happens to the house if something happens to you? Dad, do you have a current will? Dad, you really shouldn't be climbing that ladder to clean the gutters at your age. Why don't you let Brad and me take care of things like that for you? Reasonable questions, every one of them, the kind any loving daughter-in-law might ask. I answered honestly. Yes, I had a will, drawn up the year after Margaret died, leaving the house and my savings to Bradley outright, no complications, no conditions. I told her that because I had no reason not to. About 8 months ago, small things started disappearing and reappearing in slightly different places. My address book, the physical one, with 40 years of names in it, showed up on the wrong shelf in my study. A folder of bank statements I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk turned up on top of the stack instead of underneath it. I told myself I was getting forgetful. I was 68, not 98, but I'd read the same articles everyone reads about memory and aging, and I let those articles do the arguing for me instead of trusting my own eyes. Then, about 5 months ago, Vanessa started coming to the house on her own, without Bradley, always with a good reason. She'd drop off soup when I had a cold. She'd come by to check the smoke detectors because a neighbor's house had caught fire 2 streets over. She'd stop in on her lunch break just to say hello. I want to be honest with you. At the time, it felt like kindness. It took the cameras to show me it was reconnaissance. 3 months ago, I had a scare with my blood pressure, nothing dramatic, a dizzy spell in the garden that sent me to urgent care for an afternoon, and I was fine by dinner. But Vanessa was the one who drove me there, the one who sat with me in the waiting room, the one who told the nurse, unprompted, "He's been having a lot of these lately, some confusion too, some memory lapses. I just want you to note that in his file in case it's relevant." I remember blinking at her from the exam table, because I had not been having a lot of anything lately. That was the first dizzy spell I'd had in 3 years. But the nurse wrote it down. I watched her write it down. And I told myself Vanessa was just being thorough, just being a good daughter-in-law covering the bases with a doctor who didn't know my history. I want to tell you plainly, because it matters, that I did not put these pieces together in real time. I lived through them one at a time, spaced out over the better part of a year, each one small enough to excuse on its own. It's only now, looking backward with everything I've since learned, that I can lay them out in a row and see the shape of the thing they were building. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, everything came into focus all at once, on my own front porch, in front of God and the whole street. I'd had a routine follow-up appointment that morning, 10 o'clock, nothing serious, a cholesterol check, blood pressure, the kind of appointment that takes 20 minutes and ends with the doctor telling you to keep doing what you're doing. I was done by 10:40. I decided, since I was already halfway across town and the day was pleasant, cool for September, sun out, to stop and pick up a coffee and drive home the long way past the reservoir, the way Margaret and I used to drive on Sunday afternoons when we wanted to feel like we were somewhere other than Cedar Falls for 20 minutes. I pulled into my own driveway at 11:52 in the morning. My driveway. My house. The one with the maple tree Margaret and I planted the week Bradley was born, grown now into something you'd need 2 men to wrap your arms around. I noticed Vanessa's car in the driveway before I noticed anything else, parked at an angle, like she'd pulled in fast. That struck me as odd, since I hadn't known she was coming by, but I've told you already, by that point in my life I'd trained myself to explain away odd things before they finished forming into a thought. I got out of my car, walked up the flagstone path I laid myself the summer Bradley turned 9, and put my key in the lock. The door was already unlocked. That, too, I explained away in the half-second before it opened. Maybe Vanessa forgot to lock it behind her. I pushed the door open and Vanessa was standing directly inside the threshold, close enough that I nearly walked into her, and behind her, over her shoulder, I caught a glimpse, just a flash, of a man I didn't recognize standing in my dining room with a leather portfolio under his arm and a tape measure in his hand, the kind surveyors and appraisers carry. He was standing at the exact spot where Margaret's china cabinet has stood since 1991, and he was looking up at the ceiling like he was calculating something. Before I could ask a single question, before I had said one word, Vanessa's whole face changed. I watched it happen in real time, the way you watch a switch flip on a wall. Her eyes went wide, her hand flew to her chest, and she screamed, loud enough that it echoed off the Ruiz's garage across the street, "He's trespassing. Oh my God, somebody call the police, he's trespassing, he's not supposed to be here." I stood there on my own welcome mat, in front of my own front door, and I did not understand, for 3 or 4 full seconds, what I was hearing. I actually turned around to see if she was screaming at someone behind me. There was no one behind me. She was screaming at me. "Vanessa," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me even at the time, "this is my house." "Please," she said, her voice cracking theatrically, loud enough to carry, "please just go, you're scaring me, I don't know what's going on with you lately, please just leave before this gets worse." Mrs. Ruiz came out onto her front steps across the street, a dish towel still in her hand. Mr. Talbot from 2 doors down stopped his car in the middle of Winslow Court and rolled down his window. A young man walking a beagle froze on the sidewalk directly in front of my mailbox, phone already halfway out of his pocket. I could feel every one of them watching, feel the story assembling itself in real time in front of an audience I hadn't asked for and couldn't control. Confused old man. Wandering. Trespassing at a house that isn't his. Poor Vanessa, so patient with him. I did not raise my voice. 31 years of standing in front of contractors twice my size and telling them their concrete pour was wrong taught me that the loudest man in an argument is rarely the one who's believed. I said, calmly, loud enough for the street to hear but no louder, "I am not going anywhere. This is my address. My name is on the deed. I would be happy to show anyone here my driver's license." The man in the dining room appeared in the doorway behind Vanessa at that point, tape measure still in his hand, and I watched him take one look at the scene on the porch and quietly back further into the house, out of sight, the way a man does when he realizes he's stepped into something he wasn't told about. "Dad," Vanessa said, and her voice dropped, suddenly gentler, suddenly performing concern instead of fear, a full costume change in the space of one sentence, "I think you should go home and rest. I'll call Brad. We'll sort this out later, okay? I don't want you getting more upset." I looked past her one more time. The dining room was empty. The man was gone, out the back, I assumed, or into the garage. I looked at Mrs. Ruiz, who was still standing on her steps with the dish towel forgotten in her hand, and I gave her the smallest smile I could manage, the kind you give a neighbor so she doesn't spend the rest of her afternoon worrying about you. "I'll be fine, Paulette," I called across the street. Then I looked back at Vanessa. "I'm leaving because I choose to, not because you told me to. And Vanessa, I want you to know, I saw him. Whoever that was." Something in her face flickered, just for a half second, something underneath the performance, and then it was gone, smoothed back over into wounded, patient concern. I got in my car. I drove 2 blocks, pulled into the lot behind the pharmacy, and sat there with both hands on the wheel until they stopped shaking. Here is the part one have not told you yet, and it is the part that mattered most. 11 days before that Tuesday, after months of small things that didn't add up, I had already gone to a security company in the next town over, a place that didn't know my son or my daughter-in-law or anyone in Cedar Falls, and I had 4 cameras installed in my own house. 1 in the smoke detector above the front hallway. 1 built into a bookend on the shelf in my study, angled at my desk. 1 tucked into the underside of the cable box in the living room, aimed at the front door and the dining room beyond it. And 1 in the garage, mounted high in the corner where the shelving hid it from anyone who wasn't specifically looking. I hadn't told a soul. Not Bradley, not my old friend Walter Higgins, not anyone. I had told myself, at the time, that I was probably being paranoid, that I would look at the footage after a month, find nothing, and feel foolish for spending the money. I did not feel foolish. Not even close. I drove straight from the pharmacy parking lot to a motel called the Fairhaven, 20 minutes outside Cedar Falls, the kind of place with a lit-up vacancy sign and cash-only rates, and I checked in under my own name because I had done nothing wrong and had no reason to hide who I was. I sat down on the edge of a stiff motel bed with my laptop, logged into the cloud account tied to my 4 cameras, and started scrubbing backward through the footage from that morning. At 11:14 a.m., 38 minutes before I pulled into my own driveway, the front hallway camera showed Vanessa unlocking my front door with a key. Her own key, the spare I had given her and Bradley 2 years ago for emergencies, used now to let herself into my house while I was at a doctor's appointment she had no reason to know about unless she'd been keeping track of my calendar. She held the door open, and a man in a grey suit stepped through behind her, the same man I'd glimpsed in the dining room, carrying the same leather portfolio, the same tape measure clipped to his belt. I turned up the volume. "You have maybe 20 minutes, Vanessa said, her voice clipped and businesslike, nothing like the trembling voice she'd used on my porch less than an hour later. "He's got a follow-up this morning, cholesterol thing, should run long. Get your measurements and get out before he's back. I just need the square footage and the foundation photos for the appraisal file," the man said. "Gordon said he needs it by Thursday to move the listing forward." Gordon. I wrote the name down on the motel notepad, my hand not quite steady. "Fine," Vanessa said. "Just be fast." I watched, over the next several minutes, as the man moved room to room with his tape measure and a small digital camera, photographing the dining room ceiling, the foundation access panel in the hallway closet, the kitchen, the garage. Vanessa stood near the front window the whole time, checking the street, checking her phone, the posture of a lookout, not a homeowner's daughter-in-law dropping in to say hello. At 11:49 a.m., 3 minutes before I pulled into my own driveway, Vanessa's head snapped toward the window. "That's his car," she said, and her voice had an edge of real panic in it now, the first honest emotion I'd heard from her all morning. Go now, out the back, go." The man didn't go fast enough. I watched him freeze in the dining room doorway at 11:52 a.m., exactly the moment I opened my own front door, and I watched Vanessa's whole posture transform in under 2 seconds, from lookout to performer, her hand flying to her chest, her breath catching theatrically, right before she screamed the words that brought half of Winslow Court out onto their lawns. I sat on that motel bed and watched my daughter-in-law manufacture a scene, live, unscripted except in her own head, designed for exactly one purpose, to make sure that if anyone ever asked the neighbors what kind of state Edwin Marsh was in these days, they would all say the same thing. Confused. Wandering into places he doesn't belong. Poor man. Poor Vanessa, so patient with him. I did not sleep that night. I lay on top of the motel bedspread with the television off and the laptop closed, and I thought about the folder of bank statements that had moved shelves on its own 8 months ago, and the address book that turned up somewhere I hadn't left it, and the nurse writing down some confusion, some memory lapses on a chart because Vanessa told her to, and I understood, all at once. The way you understand a crack in a foundation the moment you finally see it in the right light, that I was not watching the beginning of something. I was watching the middle of something that had been under construction for the better part of a year. The next morning, I called the one person in Cedar Falls I trusted completely who had no stake whatsoever in my family. Walter Higgins had been my closest friend since we were both 26 years old and working the same construction site outside Millbridge. Walter ran a small electronics and security business now, the kind of place that installs alarm systems for the hardware store and fixes laptops for the high school down the road. I told him everything, start to finish, on his back porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. Walter didn't say a word until I finished. Then he said, "Edwin, I've known you 30 years and I've never once heard you sound like this. Show me the footage." We watched it together. When it ended, Walter sat back in his chair and said, quietly, "That man in the suit wasn't just an appraiser, Edwin. Appraisers don't need foundation access panel photos and they sure as hell don't need somebody standing lookout at the window. That's a man building a file. And the only reason you build a file like that on a house somebody else owns is if you're planning to sell it out from under them. Or prove I'm not fit to own it," I said. "He hasn't said anything else about the porch thing," she said, "so I think we're clear. Dr. Ashcroft's evaluation is scheduled for the 14th. Once that's on file with a note from urgent care, we'll have 2 independent medical sources and 3 witness statements from the neighbors. That should be more than enough for the judge." "And the house?" Gordon's voice, tinny through the recorder, but unmistakable. "Once the guardianship is granted, I'll be listed as co-guardian alongside Brad, and Brad does whatever I tell him to do," Vanessa said, and there was something in her tone, flat, businesslike, that Bradley told me afterward made his stomach turn in a way he hadn't expected, because it was the same tone she used to discuss grocery lists. "We list it through Cornerstone, same as before. I'll want 20% of net, same arrangement as the Whitfield place." "Your step-grandmother's estate went smoother," Gordon said. "No son in the picture second-guessing things." "Brad's not going to second-guess anything," Vanessa said. "He loves his father. He'll believe whatever keeps his father safe and comfortable, and by the time this is done, that's exactly what we'll be able to tell him, that we did this to keep his father safe." Bradley played that recording for Rosa Lith, Dominic, and me 2 nights later, sitting at my kitchen table, and none of us said a word for almost a full minute after it ended. Bradley's hands were shaking around his coffee cup. "Would be wise for your family to take a more active role in your day-to-day decisions, for your own safety." "Doctor," I said, keeping my voice level, "I would like you to specify, in your own words, on the record, which of my answers today were incorrect." He hesitated, just slightly, just long enough for me to hear it. "It's not about any single answer being incorrect, Mr. Marsh. It's about the overall picture your family has described to me." "I'd like to know specifically what my family described," I said. "Because I don't recall discussing any concerns of that kind with anyone in my family. Vanessa has been in close contact with my office," Dr. Ashcroft said, and there it was, on the record, on tape, exactly what Detective Jennings had needed. She's described a pattern of confusion, memory lapses, some disorientation about familiar places, over the past several months. She's a very devoted daughter-in-law. It's clear she has your best interests at heart." I sat very still. "Dr. Ashcroft, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it, because I am recording this conversation, and so are the 2 detectives in the parking lot outside your office right now." I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. "Has Gordon Blake, or anyone associated with Cornerstone Legacy Advisors, ever discussed a financial arrangement with you connected to a competency evaluation, for me or for any other patient, including a woman named Constance Whitfield in the town of Marion, 3 years ago?" Dr. Simon Ashcroft did not answer that question. What he did instead was reach for the phone on his desk, and that single motion was more of a confession than any sentence he could have said out loud. Detective Jennings and her partner were in his office within 90 seconds, because they had, in fact, been parked directly outside, waiting for my signal, a specific phrase Detective Jennings had asked me to work into the conversation the moment I believed I had enough on tape. I had said it for minutes earlier, quietly, almost conversationally. I think we've covered everything relevant here today. Vanessa was arrested in the waiting room 20 minutes later, once Detective Jennings's team had confirmed, through a phone call to Gordon Blake's office, that Vanessa herself unknowingly walked them into by trying to call him for instructions, that Gordon Blake was actively en route to the Cedar Falls County Recorder's office with paperwork prepared in advance of a guardianship ruling that had not yet, and would now never, be granted. He was taken into custody in the parking lot outside the county building 40 minutes after that, still holding the same leather portfolio I'd glimpsed under his associate's arm the day of the porch incident. I want to pause here and tell you, honestly, that watching my daughter-in-law be walked out of a medical office in handcuffs did not feel like victory. It felt like standing at the edge of a demolition site, watching a building you once thought was solid come down floor by floor, and understanding, for the first time, exactly how deep the rot had gone before anyone noticed the cracks. Bradley was not there that day. Detective Jennings had, at his own request, kept him away from the arrest itself, both to protect the integrity of his testimony and, I suspect, out of simple mercy for a man about to watch his marriage end in a parking lot. The investigation that followed took for months. Dominic Reyes's file on the Whitfield case gave the district attorney's office the pattern they needed to charge Vanessa and Gordon Blake not just for what they had attempted against me, but for conspiracy connected to Constance Whitfield's death 3 years earlier, since her estranged son from her first marriage, once contacted by Detective Jennings, revealed that he had always suspected foul play in the timing of his mother's guardianship and had simply never had the evidence to prove it. 2 more victims came forward over the following months, once local news coverage of the arrests made its way through neighboring counties, an 84-year-old widower in Marion and a retired school teacher outside Cedar Falls, both of whom had been approached by Cornerstone Legacy advisors within the past 2 years and had, by pure luck and their own stubbornness, refused to sign anything before either of them died or lost control of their homes. Dr. Simon Ashcroft surrendered his medical license and agreed to testify against Gordon Blake and Vanessa in exchange for a reduced sentence, 3 years, suspended after 18 months served, on the condition of full cooperation. His testimony, combined with financial records Dominic and the district attorney's forensic accountants pulled from Cornerstone Legacy advisors, revealed that Gordon Blake had run some version of this scheme at least 6 times over 9 years across 3 counties, netting, according to the final accounting, just under $2.1 million in commissions, forged trust arrangements, and undervalued property sales. The trial itself took place in March, 5 months after the porch incident, in the county courthouse in downtown Cedar Falls, a building I had walked past 1,000 times without ever once imagining I would sit inside it as a witness against my own son's wife. I testified for 3 hours across 2 days. I described the footage from my cameras, the appraiser with the tape measure, the scream on my porch, the recording from Dr. Ashcroft's office. Bradley testified after me, and I watched my son, 38 years old, describe finding the email thread on his wife's laptop and confronting her, describe the recorded phone call he made at Rosalitha's instruction, describe the particular, specific pain of loving someone for 4 years and discovering, all at once, that an entire version of her had been built for the sole purpose of being believed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. Vanessa Cole Marsh was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, fraud, and forgery, and, connected to the Whitfield case, conspiracy contributing to a vulnerable adult's endangerment. She was sentenced to 14 years, with parole eligibility after 9. Gordon Blake, given his prior disciplinary history and the scale of the operation the prosecution proved he had run across 3 counties, received 22 years. Dr. Ashcroft's cooperation earned him his reduced sentence, and Vanessa's associate, the man with the tape measure, a junior appraiser named Curtis Doyle who had, according to his own testimony, believed the whole arrangement was a legitimate real estate consultation, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony and never charged at all. Bradley filed for divorce the week after the arrests, and it was finalized 9 months later, quiet, uncontested, without a single argument over the house on Winslow Court, because there was, by then, nothing left for Vanessa to contest from a federal prison cell in another county. If you're still with me tonight, I'd love it if you'd type the word foundation down in the comments, because that word has come to mean something different to me over these last several months, and I think you'll understand why by the time we finish. I want to tell you honestly that the months after the trial were harder, in some ways, than the trial itself. Bradley moved back into his childhood bedroom for 3 months while he got his footing again, and some evenings we sat at the same kitchen table where he'd confessed everything to me, not talking much, just sitting with 2 cups of coffee, the way his mother and I used to sit some mornings without needing to fill the silence with anything at all. He asked me once, late on a Tuesday night, whether I thought he should have seen it sooner, whether there had been signs he'd simply refused to notice because he loved her. Bradley, I told him, I built houses for 31 years, and I promise you, the most dangerous crack in any foundation is the one that's been engineered to look like nothing at all. She wasn't careless. She was patient. Patient people are the hardest to catch, because they never give you a reason to look twice until it's almost too late. Mrs. Ruiz, my neighbor across the street, came by with a casserole dish about 2 weeks after the arrests, the way neighbors do, and she told me, standing in my kitchen, that she'd felt sick to her stomach the day of the porch incident, that something about the scene hadn't sat right with her even as it was happening, but that she hadn't known what to say or do, standing there with a dish towel in her hand, watching an old man get screamed at on his own porch. I should have said something, she told me. I should have asked more questions. You didn't do anything wrong, Paulette, I told her. None of us knew what we were looking at yet. That's exactly how they wanted it. There is one more part of this I want to tell you, because it changed what the whole experience meant to me, and I don't think the story is complete without it. About 6 weeks after the trial ended, Detective Carla Jennings called me and asked if I would be willing to speak with 2 of the other victims Dominic Reyes had helped identify, the retired schoolteacher outside Cedar Falls and the son of the widower from Marion whose mother had passed before any of this could be stopped. I said yes without hesitating, though I'll admit I spent the drive over rehearsing what I could possibly say to people whose losses were so much larger than mine, since my house was still standing and my name was still on the deed and I had, in the end, lost far less than either of them. The retired school teacher's name was Doris Kellerman, 79 years old, sharp as a tack, with a laugh that filled up her whole small kitchen the way Margaret's used to fill ours. She told me that a man from Cornerstone Legacy Advisors had approached her son 2 years earlier, offering, in her son's words, some free guidance on protecting mom's assets as she gets older, and that her son, to his credit, had gotten a strange feeling about the whole arrangement and quietly stopped returning the man's calls before anything had been signed. I didn't even know how close I'd come, Doris told me, sitting across her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going lukewarm between us, until the detective called and told me my name had turned up in a filing cabinet in a stranger's office. It's a terrible thing, Edwin, to realize you were a line item in somebody's spreadsheet for 2 years and never knew it. The son from Marion, a soft-spoken man named Peter Whitfield, was harder to sit with. His mother, Constance, had died in an assisted living facility that he had not chosen for her and could not, at the time, afford to change. 14 months after a guardianship he'd had no standing to contest had taken her home out from under her. He told me he had spent 3 years believing his own suspicions were simply grief looking for someone to blame, the same way I had spent the better part of a year believing my own instincts were simply the ordinary forgetfulness of getting older. You were lucky, he told me, not unkindly, just honestly, that you had the cameras before it went as far as it went with her. I didn't know to look until it was already over. I did not know what to say to that, and I told him so, plainly, and he nodded like that was the right answer, better than false comfort would have been. Out of that meeting, and at Rosalith Pike's suggestion, the three of us, along with Bradley and Detective Jennings, started something small, a monthly gathering at the community center on Cedar Street for anyone in the county who suspected a family member or a so-called financial advisor might be building a similar kind of case against them. We called it, plainly, the Winslow Court Group, after the street where mine had almost happened, and by the 4th month we had 11 regular members, ranging from a 63-year-old man whose stepson had started asking oddly specific questions about his pension, to an 88-year-old woman who had, entirely on her own initiative, already hired a private investigator before anyone told her that was a sensible thing to do. I stood up at one of those meetings, about 4 months after the trial, and told the room the whole story, start to finish, the porch, the scream, the cameras, the motel room, the recording device sewn into my collar, and when I finished, a woman near the back, maybe 70 years old, raised her hand and asked me the question I still think about most. How did you know to trust the cameras over your own family? She used the word same arrangement, Rosalith said quietly. That's not a slip of the tongue. That's a business model. There's a competency evaluation scheduled for the 14th, I said. That's 5 days from now. Then we move before the 14th, Rosalith said. We're not going to sit back and let Dr. Ashcroft put his signature on a piece of paper that could take away your right to make your own decisions. We have enough now. Dominic, I need everything you have on Cornerstone Legacy Advisors and the Whitfield case formatted for the County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Elder Abuse Unit by tomorrow morning. Edwin, I need to make one phone call tonight, and I want you both on it. The phone call was to Detective Carla Jennings, a 20-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department who ran what the department called, without much fanfare, the Vulnerable Adults Unit, 3 detectives and a part-time paralegal who handled every case in the county involving elder financial exploitation. Rosalith had worked with her before. Carla Jennings listened to the recording, reviewed the camera footage, and read through Dominic's file on the Whitfield case in a conference room at the station house with the 4 of us sitting across from her, and when she finished, she folded her hands on the table in almost the exact same gesture Rosalith had used in her office weeks earlier. Mr. Marsh, she said, what you've handed us tonight is the strongest elder financial exploitation case I've seen cross this desk in 6 years. But I want to be honest with you about what happens next, because it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be small. Gordon Blake has done this before, which means he's careful, which means an arrest based on the Whitfield case alone would take months to build properly through the county. But you've handed us something better than a cold case. You've handed us an active one, still moving, with a hard deadline 5 days out. What do you need from us? Bradley asked. Detective Jennings looked at me directly. Mr. Marsh, I need you to let this evaluation happen. I sat back in my chair. You want Dr. Ashcroft to examine me and put false information about my competency into an official medical record. I want you to let him try, she said. Because the moment he does, with your consent and full knowledge, and with a recording device on you the entire time, he stops being a doctor covering for a scheme on paper, and he becomes a man committing medical fraud on tape, in real time, in front of witnesses we control. That evaluation is the single cleanest piece of evidence we could ever get on Ashcroft, and it hands us Gordon Blake's entire timeline in the process, because Gordon will be expecting the file the same day. I looked at Rosalith. She nodded slowly. It's a risk, she said, but it's a controlled one, and Edwin, I think you already know you're the only person in this room who spent 31 years learning how to stay perfectly calm while someone else insists the foundation underneath you is cracked. I thought about Constance Whitfield, dead 14 months after a stranger's signature took her home out from under her. I thought about the man with the tape measure standing in my dining room, calculating the value of the walls Margaret had chosen the color for. I thought about Vanessa's voice on that recording, flat and businesslike, discussing my future the way you discuss a listing price. "Set it up," I said. The 14th arrived cold and overcast, the first real hint of autumn Cedar Falls had seen all year. Dr. Simon Ashcroft's office sat in a converted ranch house on Route 9, a waiting room with dated magazines and a fish tank nobody had cleaned in a while. I wore a small recording device sewn into the collar of my shirt, provided and tested twice by Detective Jennings's team, and I sat in that waiting room next to Vanessa, who had insisted on driving me herself, chatting pleasantly about the weather, about Bradley's work, about a recipe she'd tried the week before, as though she had not spent the previous 10 days orchestrating the legal erasure of my ability to make my own decisions. Dr. Ashcroft called me back at 2:15 in the afternoon. He was a narrow, soft-spoken man in his 50s with a habit of nodding before you'd finished speaking, and he began the appointment with what sounded, on the surface, like an ordinary cognitive screening, asking me to remember 3 words, asking me to count backward from 100 by sevens, asking me the date and the name of the current president. I answered every question correctly, promptly, without hesitation, the way any competent adult would. At 2:31, he set his pen down and said, gently, the way you deliver bad news to a child, "Mr. Marsh, I'm seeing some patterns here that concern me a little." "What patterns?" I said. "I answered every question you asked me." "It's more about the overall clinical picture," he said, and I heard, in his tone, the same careful, rehearsed cadence I imagine a man practices before he says something he knows isn't true. "Combined with the intake notes from your urgent care visit in June, and some concerns your family has shared with me directly, I think it would be responsible for me to note some mild but observable cognitive decline in my evaluation. It's nothing to be frightened of. It simply means it." I told her the truth. I didn't, not at first. I trusted the cameras because I had spent 31 years learning that a building doesn't lie about where its weight is actually going, even when everyone standing inside it insists the walls feel solid. People can perform concern. People can perform love, for months, sometimes for years, if the reward at the end is large enough. But a hidden camera has no reason to perform anything at all. It simply shows you where the weight really went. Bradley has rebuilt something like a life since then, slower than either of us expected, but steadily. He started seeing someone new about 8 months ago, a woman named Claudia who works at the county library and who Bradley says asked him, on their second date, completely unprompted, whether he had a current will and whether his father was doing all right on his own in that big house, and he told me he nearly laughed out loud at the dinner table, not because the question was funny, but because it was, for the first time in a long while, exactly the kind of ordinary, decent concern a person asks because they actually care, and not because they're building a file. I want to close tonight by telling you the same thing I told Bradley, because I think it's the reason I decided to share this story at all. If something in your gut tells you a piece of paper has moved on a shelf where you didn't leave it, if a nurse writes something in your chart that you never said, if someone who loves you starts asking a few too many careful questions about your will and your house and what happens if something happens to you, do not talk yourself out of what you're noticing. I spent the better part of a year explaining away small, ordinary-looking cracks because the alternative, believing that someone I loved was patiently building a case against my own mind, felt too monstrous to consider. It wasn't paranoia that saved me in the end. It was the willingness to finally stop explaining things away and go looking for proof. I still walk past that dining room some evenings and picture the tape measure in that stranger's hand, calculating the value of a ceiling Margaret and I chose the color for together, and I think about how close I came to spending my final years being managed instead of living, simply because I was tired, and grieving, and willing, for a while, to believe that the people closest to me could never be the ones drawing the blueprint. I don't tell you that to frighten you. I tell you because the fear, once you've walked all the way through it and come out the other side, stops being fear and starts being something more useful. It becomes vigilance. And vigilance, unlike fear, doesn't wear you down. It just asks you to keep your eyes open a little longer than feels comfortable, and to trust that longer look over anyone's performance, no matter how convincing, no matter how many years they've had to practice it. Document everything. Trust the people who have earned it, and only them. And if you ever find yourself standing on your own porch, being told by someone you love that you don't belong in the life you built with your own 2 hands, remember that the truth does not need you to raise your voice to be true. It only needs time, patience of its own, and somebody willing to keep the cameras running until the story finally tells itself. Thank you for walking through this with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, so these stories keep finding the people who need to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me, if you were standing in my place on that porch, would you have confronted her right then, in front of the whole street, or would you have done what I did, and let the cameras finish the argument for you? I read every single one of your comments, and I want to know what you would have done. And one last note before I go. As I mentioned earlier, this account draws on real and recurring patterns of elder financial exploitation, but certain names, timelines, and details have been adjusted for privacy and for the sake of the telling. If stories like this aren't the right fit for you tonight, I understand completely, and I hope you'll find something else that serves you better. For everyone still here with me, thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know.